A New York City police officer opens her front door to a homicide detective. The news is brutal. Her estranged husband has been murdered. She gasps, burying her face in her hands, playing the part of the grieving widow to perfection. But behind the tears, there is a cold, calculated thrill. The officer isn't shocked by the execution. She ordered it. The badge she wore to protect the innocent was just a shield, hiding a predator who tried to buy a double assassination. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Valerie Cincinelli was not a product of the criminal underworld. She was an enforcer of the law, a woman who spent 12 years navigating the complex, often brutal streets of Queens as an officer for the New York Police Department. She understood the mechanics of a homicide investigation better than most, because she had stood on the other side of the yellow tape. Outwardly, her career trajectory projected dedication and competence. In the summer of 2017, she even tasted the brief, intoxicating rush of public heroism. When a bank robbery unfolded in her precinct, Cincinelli reacted with the sharp, decisive instincts drilled into her at the academy. She played a pivotal role in foiling the heist, earning a commendation and the respect of her commanding officers. Standing in a crisp Navy uniform, she looked the part of the perfect cop. But that polished, professional exterior was nothing more than a fragile veneer, masking a volatile and dangerous psychological landscape. Her experience on the force eventually landed her a specialized, behind-the-scenes assignment in the NYPD's Viper unit. This was the department's video surveillance nerve center. Inside a dimly lit room humming with the low vibration of heavy servers, Cincinelli spent her shifts staring into a wall of glowing monitors. She watched the city from a godlike vantage point, tracking the movements of suspects across thousands of interconnected cameras. She learned the exact moments criminals slipped up. She studied their digital footprints, the blind spots in the surveillance grid, and the meticulous ways detectives pieced together timelines from scattered footage. It was an education in catching killers. Ultimately, she would attempt to use this very knowledge as a masterclass in how to get away with murder. Despite the commendations and her specialized skills, the NYPD brass recognized that something was fundamentally broken within Cincinelli. The rigid discipline required to wear the badge vanished the moment she clocked out. Her home in Oceanside, a quiet Long Island suburb with neatly manicured lawns and spacious driveways, was far from a domestic sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker of escalating aggression. Cincinelli possessed a hair-trigger temper, an explosive, irrational rage that could ignite over the slightest provocation. Her personal life was a chaotic web of intense arguments, screaming matches, and threats. She demanded absolute control over her partners, and when she felt that control slipping, her reactions were terrifying. The breaking point occurred long before any hitman was hired. In 2017, the exact same year she was lauded for stopping the Queens bank robber, her private life imploded violently enough to breach the walls of her precinct. Following a string of highly volatile domestic disputes involving both her estranged husband, Isaiah Carvalho Jr., and her subsequent boyfriends, the police department intervened. The Internal Affairs Bureau investigated the endless cycle of domestic disturbances and reached a chilling conclusion. The institution that had trained her, the department that had pinned a badge to her chest, officially deemed her too emotionally unstable to carry a firearm. In a humiliating bureaucratic move, superiors stripped Cincinelli of her 9mm service Glock. She was placed on modified assignment, effectively benched from active patrol. Her days of riding in a cruiser were replaced with menial desk work, pushing paper while enduring the silent, knowing glances of her colleagues. For a woman whose entire identity was built on the power and authority of being a cop, this demotion was a devastating blow to her ego. It was a glaring, desperate red flag, a siren warning that the officer was spiraling out of control. But confiscating her weapon did not neutralize the threat. Stripped of her physical gun, Cincinelli simply changed tactics. She began to weaponize her mind, her manipulative charm, and her deep insider knowledge of the justice system. The NYPD had taken away her ability to pull a trigger, so she decided to find someone else to pull it for her. To understand the depths of this obsession with control, one has to look at the wreckage of her marriage to Isaiah Carvalho Jr. They had shared a life, a home, and a young son, but the union was defined by its fractures. Carvalho bore the brunt of her hair-trigger temper. By early 2018, the relationship had completely disintegrated. Carvalho filed for divorce, seeking a desperate way out of the constant emotional crossfire. But in Cincinelli's mind, a partner did not just get to walk away. The separation ignited a bitter, protracted legal battle, primarily centered around custody and assets. The quiet, tree-lined streets of their Long Island neighborhood frequently echoed with the muffled sounds of slamming doors and vicious arguments. The domestic environment was toxic, heavy with the suffocating tension of two people who had grown to despise one another. There was one specific asset that drove the suspended officer into a state of blind, unyielding fury: her NYPD pension. In the state of New York, a spouse is legally entitled to a portion of that retirement fund. To a career cop, the pension is sacred. It represents decades of navigating dangerous streets, the stress, the mandatory overtime, the freezing winter night shifts, and the heavy toll the job takes on the body and mind. The idea that Carvalho would receive a cut of her hard-earned money felt like a profound, unforgivable betrayal. She obsessively calculated the financial loss, viewing it not as a legal standard, but as a personal theft. Her resentment metastasized. It became a daily fixation. She spent hours pacing her living room, verbally tearing into her ex-husband to anyone who would listen. The money was hers, she had earned it, and she would do anything to protect it. In the midst of this toxic divorce, a new figure entered her crosshairs. John DiRubba was an older man with a rough-around-the-edges demeanor that belied a surprisingly accommodating personality. He was instantly captivated by the off-duty cop. She was commanding, fiercely protective of her space, and carried an undeniable magnetic intensity. At first, their dynamic felt like a passionate whirlwind. DiRubba provided a distraction from the crushing reality of family court. He was attentive, generous, and completely devoted to her. He would drive miles out of his way just to bring her dinner or run errands, eager to please a woman who demanded absolute loyalty. But the honeymoon phase evaporated almost overnight. The same controlling behaviors that suffocated Carvalho soon wrapped around DiRubba like a vice. Cincinelli demanded constant updates on his whereabouts. If he did not answer his phone immediately, she spiraled into wild accusations and rage. Her anxiety manifested as a desperate need to dictate every hour of his day. DiRubba found himself walking on eggshells, constantly trying to placate a woman whose emotional baseline was pure hostility. He absorbed the screaming matches, the hurled insults, and the erratic mood swings, rationalizing it all as the temporary stress of her impending divorce. He thought he could fix her, or at least calm the storm. He was dead wrong. Yet, the true catalyst for the impending horror was not her ex-husband. It was DiRubba's 14-year-old daughter. The teenager lived a completely normal life, residing in a neighboring town just a few miles away. She was entirely removed from the chaotic orbit of her father's new girlfriend. She went to school, hung out with friends, and expected the standard emotional and financial support any child needs from a parent. But in Cincinelli's distorted psychological landscape, this child was not a daughter, she was a rival. The suspended officer's jealousy defied all logic. It was a pathological, all-consuming hatred. Whenever DiRubba spent time with the teenager, Cincinelli's anger boiled over. She resented every dollar he spent on the girl, every weekend they shared, and every ounce of affection that diverted his attention away from her. She viewed his basic parental obligations as a direct, personal insult. The teenager was unknowingly draining resources, both emotional and financial, that Cincinelli firmly believed belonged exclusively to her. This was not typical step-parent friction. It was a terrifying manifestation of absolute narcissism. She demanded total emotional subjugation from her partner. When DiRubba bought his daughter gifts, paid for her clothes, or simply wanted to spend a Saturday afternoon with her, Cincinelli perceived it as a direct threat to her own security and dominance. She complained bitterly about the girl, her private rants becoming increasingly vicious and unhinged. She tracked the money DiRubba spent, obsessing over the math, just as she had with her police pension. The financial paranoia was a sickness, clouding her judgment and poisoning her every interaction. The resentment formed a deadly, inescapable nexus in her mind. On one side, her estranged husband was legally poised to take a massive cut of her hard-earned money. On the other, a teenager was taking her new boyfriend's time and resources, money that Cincinelli felt she was entitled to control. She felt cornered, victimized by the very people she was supposed to care for. For a woman trained to assess, confront, and neutralize threats on the streets of New York, the solution began to look horrifyingly simple. The anger was no longer just verbal venting. It was crystallizing into a concrete plan, a coldly calculated strategy to permanently erase the obstacles in her path. The surveillance expert was about to go on the offensive. The winter of 2019 hung heavy over Long Island, a bitter, biting cold that seemed to perfectly mirror the atmosphere inside the Oceanside residence. By February, the suspended officer's resentment had calcified into a permanent state of hostility. The daily routine devolved into an endless, obsessive loop of financial calculations regarding her NYPD pension and vicious rants about the teenager who was allegedly draining her boyfriend's bank account. But beneath the surface of this domestic misery, a far more sinister cognitive shift was taking place. The grievances were no longer just complaints. They were becoming a target list. The transition from a bitter ex-wife to a domestic terrorist did not happen with a sudden snap. It was a slow, terrifying normalization of violence. She began dropping hypothetical scenarios into casual evening conversations. She would study John DiRubba, carefully gauging his reactions, analyzing his demeanor with the same clinical detachment she once used to interrogate suspects in a Queens precinct. DiRubba carried a tough, streetwise exterior, a persona that convinced her he possessed deep connections to the local criminal underworld. She assumed he knew people who operated outside the law, people who could solve her problems for a price. Eventually, the hypotheticals vanished, replaced by a formal, chilling directive. She instructed DiRubba to reach out to his contacts and hire a professional hitman. She presented the plan with the same logistical pragmatism one might use to organize a home renovation. The targets were explicitly named. First, her estranged husband, Isaiah Carvalho Jr. Second, DiRubba's own 14-year-old daughter. The sheer, unfathomable audacity of demanding a father coordinate the assassination of his own child highlighted the depth of her narcissistic detachment. In her twisted pathology, the teenager was simply an obstacle to her financial dominance, a nuisance that needed to be permanently erased. The budget for this double assassination was meticulously calculated, $7,000. That was the exact valuation she placed on 2 human lives. To prove her terrifying sincerity, she drove to a local bank branch and withdrew the funds in cold, hard cash. Handing over the thick envelope of bills, she explained her reasoning. A cash transaction severed the digital paper trail, ensuring no financial crimes investigator could ever link the payout back to her accounts. Initially, DiRubba tried to rationalize the horrific demands. He convinced himself it was merely the dark, twisted humor of a stressed cop, a desperate woman venting her frustrations through extreme hyperbole. But as February dragged on, the demands grew increasingly specific, stripping away any illusion of a sick joke. She was not just asking for a murder, she was architecting it. Leaning heavily on her 12 years of law enforcement experience, she began lecturing him on the mechanics of a successful homicide. She detailed the necessity of establishing an airtight electronic alibi, explaining exactly how cell tower pings worked and why bringing personal devices anywhere near the crime scenes would be a fatal rookie mistake. Drawing from her specialized tenure in the Viper unit, she mapped out the vast network of city surveillance. She warned him about specific intersections equipped with automated license plate readers and detailed the blind spots where a hired killer could slip away undetected. She mapped out the timeline for Carvalho's execution first. She suggested the hitman ambush him near his workplace in Holtzville, a location she deemed isolated enough to avoid immediate witnesses. As for the teenager, the suspended officer displayed a profound lack of humanity, aggressively demanding a timeline for when the girl would be eliminated. When DiRubba attempted to stall, citing logistical issues with the fictitious hitman, she pushed back with tactical adjustments, suggesting they wait a few weeks between the murders. so the local homicide squads would not draw a connection between the two seemingly isolated events. A sickening, paralyzing realization settled in DiRubba's gut. The woman sleeping next to him was not just angry, was a highly trained, deeply methodical predator actively hunting his family. The physical toll of this realization was immense. He found himself trapped in an unimaginable psychological hostage situation. If he simply packed his bags and left, he knew she would not stop. She had the training, the badge, and the access to restricted law enforcement databases to track him and his daughter anywhere in the country. She could easily find another triggerman. Or worse, her stripped service weapon did not preclude her from acquiring an illegal firearm and doing the job herself. Going to the local authorities presented an equally terrifying risk. She was a 12-year veteran of the NYPD. She had friends in local precincts, union delegates who would protect her, and a network of blue wall loyalty that might view his accusations as the malicious lies of a bitter boyfriend. If a local detective tipped her off about his police report, the consequences would be swift and fatal. DiRubba was cornered, sharing a home with a ticking bomb, playing along with the murder-for-hire plot just to buy time. He absorbed her tactical lectures, nodded at her horrific demands, and pretended to coordinate with a phantom assassin, all while his mind raced for a viable exit strategy. By the end of the month, the burden of the deadly secret forced his hand. He realized there was only one agency equipped to dismantle a rogue cop without alerting her local network. Bypassing the local police entirely, DiRubba made a quiet, desperate drive to a federal building. He walked through the heavy glass doors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sat down with a team of special agents, and laid out the entire sprawling conspiracy. In that sterile interview room, the dynamic fundamentally changed. DiRubba transitioned from a terrified boyfriend into a highly sensitive federal asset. The FBI recognized the immediate, lethal threat posed by a police officer utilizing insider tactics to orchestrate a double homicide. But an informant's word against a decorated cop was not enough to secure a conviction. They needed undeniable, irrefutable proof. They needed her to orchestrate her own downfall on tape. The federal sting operation was officially authorized, and the trap was set. Transitioning a civilian into a federal asset against a trained police veteran is an operation fraught with catastrophic risk. The FBI understood the extreme volatility of their target. They were not surveilling an amateur. They were hunting an insider, someone intimately familiar with undercover tactics, wiretaps, and the behavioral tells of an informant. To build a bulletproof case, federal handlers outfitted the boyfriend with covert recording equipment. Microscopic lenses and highly sensitive transmitters were woven into his daily attire. The psychological burden placed on the civilian was crushing. He had to return to the Oceanside home, sit on the same couch as the woman actively trying to purchase the slaughter of his own child, and play the role of a willing accomplice. One misplaced hand during a hug, one suspicious bulge beneath his shirt, or one poorly timed nervous glance could trigger her violent instincts. The domestic space transformed into a federal listening post. Throughout the spring of 2019, audio files began flooding into FBI databases, capturing a terrifying portrait of a fractured, predatory psyche. The tapes revealed a complete absence of moral hesitation. There were no hushed, panicked whispers in the dark. Instead, the suspended officer discussed the impending double assassination with the casual, detached cadence of someone reviewing a grocery list. Federal agents listened in real time as the banality of domestic chatter seamlessly pivoted into the logistics of murder. Her expertise in law enforcement took center stage, captured perfectly on the wire. She was not relying on the phantom hitman to figure out the details. She was architecting the execution herself. The recordings caught her methodically dissecting the geography of the primary target's routine. She pinpointed her estranged husband's workplace in Holtzville, noting the specific traffic patterns and isolation of the area. She instructed the informant on exactly where the assassin should wait, evaluating the sightlines and the optimal escape routes to avoid local patrol sectors. But the most chilling audio centered on her obsession with digital forensics. Drawing heavily from her years in the NYPD's video surveillance unit, she delivered a masterclass in counterintelligence. She understood exactly how homicide detectives build timelines. The tapes captured her explicitly, detailing the absolute necessity of creating an impenetrable electronic alibi. She lectured her partner on the mechanics of cellular triangulation, how investigators subpoena historical cell site data to place suspects within a specific radius of a crime scene. Her mandate was absolute. When the kill order was finally executed, their digital footprint had to be non-existent. She instructed him that every single GPS-enabled device, smartphones, tablets, and even smartwatches, had to remain powered on and completely stationary inside her Long Island residence. Furthermore, their vehicles could not pass through any toll plazas equipped with automated license plate readers. The plan required them to physically travel to a populated public location miles away from the kill zones. They would ensure their faces were captured on multiple commercial security feeds, establishing a rock-solid, verifiable alibi while the blood was being spilled elsewhere. It was textbook reasonable doubt, engineered by a woman who had spent over a decade watching criminals make fatal operational errors. As the weeks dragged on, the operation required the informant to continuously stall. He fed her carefully crafted excuses provided by his federal handlers. The hitman was conducting surveillance. The timing was slightly off. The perimeter was too hot. The delays enraged her. The hidden microphones picked up her escalating impatience, her voice hardening with genuine frustration. She demanded results. The hostility peaked when the conversation shifted back to the secondary target. The audio captured her chilling lack of humanity as she aggressively pushed for the teenager's elimination. She suggested the assassin strike over the weekend, actively tracking the girl to a specific local hangout spot to ensure the job was done. There was no wavering, only a cold, transactional demand for finality. She wanted the financial drains on her life permanently severed. Federal prosecutors reviewing the transcripts recognized they possessed a mountain of damning evidence. They had the recorded intent, the detailed logistical planning, and the overt act of the initial cash withdrawal. But in a courtroom, a skilled defense attorney could still attempt to spin the narrative. They could argue the recordings merely captured the dark, exaggerated venting of a deeply stressed woman going through a bitter divorce, a toxic fantasy rather than a literal conspiracy. To completely neutralize any potential defense of entrapment or hyperbole, the FBI needed to push the operation past the point of theoretical planning. They needed absolute, undeniable proof of her homicidal commitment. The Bureau determined that listening was no longer enough. The surveillance phase had achieved its maximum utility. To secure an ironclad indictment against a sworn officer of the law, the federal agents prepared to cross the threshold. They needed to present her with the ultimate proof of death, look her in the eye, and record exactly how she tried to bury the truth. The sting was about to go live. May 17, 2019. The day the FBI decided the conspiracy had reached its lethal maturity. For weeks, the agents had been playing a dangerous game of shadow and light, feeding the suspended officers' hunger for vengeance while shielding the targets from genuine harm. But the masquerade had to end. They needed the final, undeniable anchor for the prosecution. The moment when the theoretical plan crossed the threshold into an active, violent reality. The Bureau staged the scene with terrifying precision. They intercepted Isaiah Carvalho Jr. in his vehicle, carefully informing him that he was the target of a high-stakes hit. With his cooperation, the agents orchestrated a grim, theatrical tableau. They took photographs of the interior of his car, artfully arranging the scene to appear as though a struggle had ended in his assassination. It was a macabre set piece, designed to satisfy the specific, bloodthirsty requirements the officer had laid out in her instructions. The FBI then turned to the second target, shielding the 14-year-old girl in a location completely unknown to the conspirators. The physical threat to both victims was neutralized. Now, the federal agents waited for the only piece of evidence that would guarantee a conviction: the confirmation of the hit. In the late morning, the informant reached out to Cincinelli, his voice strained by the weight of the federal machinery humming in the background. He delivered the news she had been clamoring for. He told her the job was done. He described the scene at the staged location, confirming that the targets had been eliminated as she had requested. He even provided the false visual proof, sending the images of the staged crime scene. For a heartbeat, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, Cincinelli's reaction was not one of horror or remorse. It was immediate, cold and entirely focused on the cleanup. She did not ask about the victims. She did not express a flicker of hesitation. She shifted instantly into the mode of a police veteran who knew exactly how the NYPD would respond to a double homicide. She directed the informant to destroy every shred of evidence that could link them to the event. She explicitly ordered him to purge his phone of every single text message, to delete the call logs, and to wipe the device clean before the inevitable knock on the door came. She was not just a client, she was managing the crime scene from a distance, utilizing her tactical knowledge to ensure the trail went cold before the local precinct even arrived. She hung up the phone and began the wait. But she wasn't waiting for the police. She was waiting to resume her life, untethered from the financial burdens that had pushed her to the brink. A few hours later, the illusion of safety shattered. Two detectives from the local precinct, cops Cincinelli knew and had worked alongside for years, pulled up to her oceanside residence. They were not there to arrest her. They were there to fulfill their duty as the primary responders to the crime scene. The lead detective approached the door with a grim expression, tasked with the most difficult notification of his career. He knocked firmly. When Cincinelli opened the door, he delivered the script. Isaiah Carvalho Jr. had been found dead in his car. Cincinelli reacted with the rehearsed grace of a seasoned performer. She went through the motions, the shock, the staggered step back, the gasping breaths, the tears that flowed right on cue. It was a masterclass in deception. She played the grieving, blindsided ex-wife to perfection, leaning into the detective as if the weight of the news was physically crushing her. Inside the house, the facade remained rigid. She excused herself, hurried to a private room, and pulled out her phone. She felt an urgent, frantic need to ensure her accomplice had followed her cleanup instructions. She dialed the informant's number, her voice trembling, not with grief, but with the high-stakes anxiety of a criminal ensuring the evidence was erased. She demanded to know if he had scrubbed the messages. She reinforced the command. Delete everything, get rid of the logs, don't leave a single byte of data behind. She was still in the mindset of a Viper unit officer, confident that if the digital paper trail was gone, the case would disintegrate into an unsolvable mystery. She was wrong. The FBI had not just been recording the calls, they had been monitoring the entire architecture of her deceit. Every word she spoke, every tactical instruction she issued, and every panicked directive to hide the evidence was streaming directly into a federal server. As she hung up, finally feeling that the loose ends were tied, the reality of her environment changed. The air in the oceanside house seemed to grow heavy. Through the windows, she might have seen the flash of dark SUVs rolling silently onto the street. The detectives she had just performed for were likely already moving toward their secondary objective. The FBI did not wait for the local police to finish their formal notification. They did not care about protocol. They moved in with overwhelming force. Agents swarmed the residence, their tactical gear flashing in the midday light. The front door was breached, and Cincinelli, who had spent the morning orchestrating a murder from the comfort of her living room, found herself surrounded by the very agency that had been listening to her for months. The handcuffs clicked shut with finality. The badge-wearing protector of the law was suddenly the subject of a federal indictment. As they led her out, she was no longer a cop. She was a defendant in a federal murder-for-hire investigation. The cold calculation that had carried her through the winter of 2019 had finally, and spectacularly, collided with the reality of federal justice. Her career, her pension, her reputation, and her freedom evaporated in that singular moment of surrender. The observer in the Viper unit had finally been observed, and she was completely, utterly caught. The judicial process moved with the same swift, crushing momentum as the FBI raid. Cincinelli's arraignment occurred shortly after her arrest, severing her completely from the life she had known. There was no leniency for a disgraced officer. The judge ordered her held without bail, locking her in a federal holding cell while the media devoured the spectacle of a corrupt cop. The prosecution possessed hours of damning audio, but trials involving undercover sting operations are inherently unpredictable. Instead of risking a drawn-out courtroom battle over entrapment defenses, federal prosecutors offered a calculated plea deal. The explosive murder-for-hire charges were ultimately dropped. In their place, Cincinelli pleaded guilty to a single count of obstruction of justice, a formal acknowledgement of her desperate, frantic attempts to destroy the electronic evidence of her assassination plot. She stood before a federal judge, permanently stripped of her authority, and listened to the final verdict. The sentence was 48 months in federal prison, 4 years behind bars for a woman who had spent over a decade putting others there. We inherently trust those sworn to protect us. We believe a badge represents a shield against the monsters lurking in the dark. But Valerie Cincinelli proved that sometimes the predator wears the uniform. She attempted to weaponize her deep law enforcement expertise to slaughter her own family, hunting them from behind a veil of absolute authority. In the end, the very system she tried to outsmart became the trap that broke her. A brutal reminder that the most lethal threats are often the ones entrusted with our safety. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.